Hello, folks. This is your Peachy Ticker update coming at you on the 11th. What did I tell you was going to happen? The House clowned the process, essentially attempting to impeach on a maladministration charge. And obstruction of Congress is not an impeachable offense. Obstruction of justice is, but you first have to go through the justice process, and we haven't done that. If you remember, President Nixon resigned after he lost at the Supreme Court and had the choice of either handing over the documentation that the Congress wanted, which proved that he had tampered with the record, or the alternative was to tell him to go pound sand, at which point they were going to get him on obstruction of justice. And at that point, his public support and his congressional support collapsed. That was the point at which he resigned. And he resigned rather than face that trial. He knew it was going to happen. So President Clinton, on the other hand, put his middle finger up and ultimately was impeached, but not convicted. And now we have Lindsey Graham saying there's going to be no evidence heard in the Senate. I don't know if he's right or not, but I bet he is, because he has control over some of the committees that are involved in this. And my guess is that's exactly what's going to happen. It's going to go into the Senate. It's going to get basically a vote down right there. And if you can get 50 votes, it's over. And if not, then they're gonna hold a perfunctory process and try to let the Democrats try to come up with 60 votes, which they will not be able to do because there just simply is no there. So it's been intentionally clowned. Pelosi's done that as well. The real issue is the abuse that's been served up upon this country by the FISA court, and the FISA court, by the way, has done nothing about it. The judiciary is within its rights and has the power to take its own corrective action on this matter and has not done so. And they have had this report, and they've known what's been done to them for years. It's been years now, and have not done so. 2 years. There is a problem here, folks, with this process, and we'd better put a stop to it, because you now have Democrats that are out there saying publicly that the only possible free and fair election is one that elects a Democrat, that any other outcome is illegitimate. You can't have another fair election unless a Democrat wins. Do you realize what that is? That's a statement straight out of the Soviet Politburo. I mean, my God, Nikolai Khrushchev, he's going to win. Stalin, he's going to win. We're going to have an election, but Stalin is going to win with 95% of the vote. And if he doesn't, well, then the election isn't legitimate. And let's say we're going to find out who voted for everybody else, and we're going to cut off their head. Throw them in the gulag. Yeah. So we have Washington, D.C. that has made these statements. It is time for the American public to start drafting another Declaration of Independence. And mean it. Of course, that means that the American public has to contemplate what the appropriate remedial actions are. And this is not going to be a simple situation at all. The big problem with the civil service system as it stands today is that it is locust in Washington, D.C., which used to be a hellhole back in the 1700s and early 1800s, before you had flush toilets, before you had all of the other things that go along with modern life, before you had electrical power. It was this was a literal hellhole, and so we've got a real problem here. This is an extraordinary circumstance in that you can't just say, well, we'll fire blah, because that's not enough. Your entire base of people who you could replace them with are the same people. I'm not sure what the reorganization of our federal government is that would lead to a positive outcome, but we, the people of this country, need to have that conversation. We need to figure out what it is, and then we need to execute on it. And we're not going to enjoy this process, but we need to undertake it, and we need to do it now. I remind you that the brigandry that is going on, and by the way, all of this stems from that brigandry, okay? This all stems from Americans who are connected to those in public office using the American taxpayer's tit as a means of sucking sustenance out of them on a matter and in a form and fashion that would be illegal as hell if it was conducted out in the open, and nobody would stand for it. People would go to prison. They would absolutely end up in jail. And yet, no big deal, and yet you hear every single day, you see another thing out of SDNY or one of the other U.S. attorneys, well, this person ripped off little old ladies for $200,000, and therefore he's going to go to prison, he's going to have to answer for his crimes. And yet we have hard evidence that Hunter Biden managed to pull this off twice with the help of his dad. The second one is arguably the even more egregious one in that he flew on Air Force Two over to China to do it. And yet nobody thinks that we should do anything about this. Why are we paying 10 times as much for prescription drugs and 5 times as much for every other kind of medical care as anybody else in the world? And by the way, we're paying 2 and 3 times as much as socialist systems, which are always more inefficient and more full of scams than capitalist ones, because there's no price signal. We must have a conversation about what a second Declaration of Independence should look like, how you would form it, what your demands for relief are, and what the or else is. Are we willing to stand up and say, and the or else is, you no longer rule us. Washington, D.C. is no longer the capital of the United States, period. We're seceding. All of us. All that's left is Washington, D.C. You go ahead and you rule over Washington, D.C. Oh, by the way, there's an embargo on the Potomac. Nobody goes in or out. And we're going to put a blockade up if an embargo doesn't work. Oh, you got power? Well, you got your little nuclear reactor down in the basement of the Pentagon. How much more electricity do you need? Have a nice day, guys. Go back to the 1700s where you got to take a crap in the middle of the street. And we'll see how well that river works as a drinking water source when you can't have a modern pumping and purification system. Let it die. Cut it off and let it die. I have a suspicion that the only answer to be found in this, in the modern day, is to decentralize the civil service and decentralize the government in such a way that there is no concentration, and that the representation within both is approximately equal to the land masses that are in question. Now, of course, the left will scream about this because the left is concentrated in one place, but they don't have to be. That's a choice. You can't find a Republican in Washington, D.C. You take a look at the voting records, the number of registered Republicans, the number of registered Democrats. There is no possible way that you can have a bipartisan kind of system the way our government is currently constituted. And yet it wasn't supposed to work like that because the founders couldn't have possibly foreseen that you could deal with the bugs and having to crap in the streets and the lack of a public water system and no electricity. All of these things made places that used to be hellholes now actually rather pleasant and inhabitable. But D.C. was not that sort of a place. People didn't want to stay there. They didn't want to be there. They wanted to go home. They came in, they did their legislative business, and they left. Not anymore. But, I don't think you can fix this with the entrenchment that's taken place. I think this country needs a divorce. And quite frankly, the landmass and the way that works out is not really all that hard to enforce, people. But, you don't do this lightly, and you don't do it without a lot of conversation and a lot of contemplation and committees and people getting together and having that conversation. And you know where you start? You start in your local pub. When you go out tonight or tomorrow or this weekend and you go have a beer with your friends or something to drink, something to eat, whatever, this is the conversation you ought to be having. Where are we today in this country when we have 17 sets of abuses perpetrated upon a court to spy on a political campaign, and the judge does nothing. The court itself does nothing, despite knowing factually that they were lied to. They do nothing. Hey, guess what, guys? That could be used against the other side. If you are a Democrat, if you're on the blue side of the aisle, what makes you think you're immune to this? You're not. You think this won't be used against you? It will. Do you think that this entire system can be fixed without tearing it down and coming up with something that is transparent and has checks and balances and truly represents the land masses of this country on a representative basis? Not this BS where 99% of the people in Washington, D.C. are hard blue and half of them are radical leftists. Socialists are worse. We have the Politburo in D.C. right now. And we have a fiscal crisis staring us in the face that is going to attempt to spend at a level that will place a $2 trillion a year deficit on the federal budget. And if you think that the people of this country and of the world are going to finance that over the next 5 years, you have rocks in your head. We have time to resolve this peacefully, but we must start now. I'm your Chicka guy. And that's how it is.